Hello, I'm Li Hao. So, it's Svelte question time. You have any question about Svelte? I have answers for you. And question for today is about how do you create dynamic elements in Svelte? How do you create dynamic elements in Svelte? So this is a very common question. I see these questions a lot. A lot of times you want to dynamically use elements like for some situation for some conditions I want to use div to render this component, but then some other reasons you want to use a span, sometimes you want a h1, sometimes you want a buttons, and Svelte is not dynamic enough. You can't really change elements in runtime to different things because Svelte actually compiles your codes to JavaScript. That's part of the reason why, and because of compilation, we allow us to do some optimization. For example, we can optimize our code for certain inputs and certain buttons and things like that. But with that, it makes us even harder to in runtime dynamically switch different elements. But you can do that in React. So I want to do it in Svelte as well. How? So this is what we're gonna answer today, and let's check that out. So if you try to Google about this question, you would most likely end up with this issue over here. It says proposal, dynamic elements, Svelte elements, and then if you scroll down, hope for some magic solution, you would realize that this is still an open issue and it's not yet closed. So what should we do? Right here I have some interesting suggestions and solutions out here, and there's even actually an open PR available, but it's not ready to be merged yet. There's still some things to be polished. And why is that so hard to do it in Svelte compared to React? Is there's a lot of things that we need to do in the compile time, and we need to there are some complications in terms of optimization that Svelte actually have by default for normal elements, but for dynamic elements we kind of have to give up some of the things. And I want to show you one example, a React example apparently, about how React handle this, and you realize that I don't know about you, but let's take a look. And personally I feel that it's not there's rooms to be optimized. And we will take a look at this example over here. So one example that I prepared over here is written in React. You have choices, which is choices of elements that you can use, and in React it's so amazing that you can just write strings and you can create components out of string, right? I mean React is amazing as well. It's so React and Svelte equally amazing. There's no reason that you love Svelte and you must hate React, right? So over here it's so dynamic where you have this an array of different strings, and they're actually elements, and I have this reducer function to switch between different indexes, and over here I will have this element that says that which elements that I'm using, and over here I have to use a capital letter because this hints that it's a component. It's not a normal elements or custom elements, right? It's a component. I can use it over here. So here when I switch between different choices, you see that it switched between a div, a span, a button, and a h1 tag. Alright, that's amazing. That's simple. So that's simple to do in React. But one thing that I want to notice that React does not do that well, and I'm not sure whether we can do equally well. We can like optimize this in Svelte or not, right? It's something that we need to figure it out together. Is that if you take a look over here, inspect these elements, and you inspect this span over here. This span says box children here, right? You inspect this span over here, and I try to assign this span elements to a global variable. So I'm gonna say a span equals to 0. Okay, So I assign this span. So you take a look, if I hover over here, you see that this highlights this span element over here. Let me zoom it one more so that you can see it much clearly with this HTML over here. And also maybe let's see whether I can zoom it one more so that you can see that when I hover, it's clearly showing that this span is this box children span over here. Okay, and as I switch, you still see this span element over here. Looks like nothing has changed. But if you try to read this out, span 2 equals to 0, 1, you realize that this span, right? This is the one that is right now on the screen. It's not the same as the span over here. So if I hover over here, it's no longer on the screen. It's no longer on the screen. It's being destroyed, discarded. You create another span element actually. So if you say span equals to span 2, it's actually false. They are not the same element. So what does that mean? That means that because React treats this as a component, and as the component changes, everything inside the component is being thrown away and recreated. So the span and anchor tag over here, like although it is really static, right? You look at here, you kind of know that this is the same element. You just create a new span, shove all my children in there, and replace it. That's all, right? Why do you want to throw everything away and recreate it? Because it's not that simple. It is not that simple. React has no way to know during compile time to optimize this to say that, okay, actually the children, I can just move the children because I'm just gonna change the so-called container element. And yeah, like one hint that we as a Svelte, as a compiler, may have like the information that we may have during compile time, and if we have that, then we could potentially optimize it. Right? I don't have a guarantee for here that it will be done, but yeah, it can be done, but there's room that we can do over here, and that's something that I actually want to see in if we have this Svelte element, special elements, right? If we have this proposal shipped to user, this is something that I would love to see that we can do, right? That is like one level up optimized code, that optimized runtime that you see. You create a container, shove all the elements in, and then just replace it, right? That is much better than throw everything away and recreate them, right? Because this is a very trivial contrived example, but what if you have all the events listeners attached? You have to remove them and reattach and things like that. Of course, maybe React does not have to do that because it has a concept called what's that event? Sorry, tip of my tongue, but I can't remember. But what if it kind of listens, it captures all the events on the root level, and all the elements created will actually propagate all the events to one event listeners that handle like a super event listeners at the root level of your React component that handles everything. So at least because of that, because React knows that attaching and detaching event listeners is costly, right? So there is some sort of optimization over there as a runtime. But in Svelte, usually we don't do that. We just attach event listeners directly to the elements. Much simpler mental model, right? If you remove this element, you just discard it. So I feel like in our case, we might want to figure a way to optimize this dynamic element case. So that's case number 1. And case number 2, why dynamic elements is so hard to optimize is that sometimes you have inputs like, so here I'm going to open up REPL and I'm going to show you this. And you may have seen this, but you never noticed is that if I say inputs bind checked equals to check, you realize that the error, you end up with a compile error, and it says that checked can only be bind with a checkbox input. So this means that actually it's Svelte like go one extra mile to notice that, hey, your input has to define as a checkbox, have to have type checkbox, because only then the checked binding makes sense, right? Because if you have an input text, check binding does not make sense at all. So there's some sort of checking over here. In React, it's done on a runtime, and in Svelte, it's done on a compile time. It has to check whether the checkbox. So this has to be like the input type checkbox has to be written ahead of time, statically, so that Svelte can analyze this and know like what kind of event listeners to attach, what kind of properties to read out from this checkbox, so that it can do its two-way binding for this checked property. Right? But once this is become something that is dynamic, so if it's dynamic, it will be something you can see it as some sort of like some component, right? Dynamic elements. If it's something as dynamic as this, then there's no way we can optimize in terms of like listeners, like what kind of listeners you need to listen. Are you actually input? You just want you can't really bind check. Things like that is hard for dynamic elements, right? So yeah, life is hard. Maybe we have to have some compromises. So that will be something that needs to be polished before this feature even's gonna be shipped out to all users, right? That is something I would love to see from Svelte. So here, I spent almost quite a while, a long time to explain why this is so hard to be implemented in Svelte. So what are the options that we are left with, and what can we do as a users? And I don't want to create this video to disappoint you and do not give you something. So I actually prepared something interesting, but I'm going to leave it behind. But before that, I'm going to show you some alternatives and a great learning alternatives behind, right? So firstly, this is what I would usually recommend if you want to have like dynamic elements. Because as I said, like the second point why is it so hard to optimize is that for cases like select element, option elements, input elements, these are the edge cases that makes it hard for event listeners and bindings. But most of the situation that you want to use with dynamic elements are like div, span, that does not have to be does not have bindings at all, right? At most, maybe scrolling events by scroll position kind of bindings, right? So here, usually I say like if your use case are limited to, if you know ahead of time, the use case are limited to maybe 4, because just now in the React example we see 4 elements, right? What if you know that you are limited to 4 elements? What you can do is you have a component called box over here. So here it's actually almost the same code that we've seen earlier on, where we have span and an anchor tag. So you have a box element, and you create a component that looks like this, where it wraps around div for different kind of wraps around the slots with different kind of elements, right? Div, span, button, h1, right? So you switch between different props to use the different elements to wrap around your slots. So here, if you toggle on, everything works fine. Div, span, buttons, and h1. And if you inspect element and try to play around with that trick just now that I showed you, where I say I have a span, and I assign span to this global variable called span, right? Hover, this is the span, and I switch, and I take a look over here, this span, and span 2 equals to 0. You realize that this is the span that we have previously is being destroyed, is not being used anymore. Span is not equal to span 2, it's false, right? This suffers the same issue as React, right? Because it works the same way, where you have actually a different slots elements, which means you are slotting in different places, and because you are actually like slotting in different elements, so you slots is like a component where you over here, if you have a different if, you're actually throwing one slots away and create a new slots on the other end, right? So you recreate elements, but depends on your use case. This may be just fits what you want. And another alternative that looks similar to this is a Svelte elements. So this library Svelte elements is try to use Svelte components to kind of achieve your Svelte elements, right? What this means is that it actually creates a list of components. Let me zoom it up a bit. That look at here. So you have Svelte component, and this you pass in different components, right? Block quote or P or div, they're all exported from Svelte elements. And if you go to look at their source code, you'll realize that they recreate the whole list of possible HTML elements, right? For example, for this, let's say I want to look at anchor tag. Realize that it's a component, but then it actually itself creates anchor elements. So for the bold component itself is wrapping a slot with a B bold element. So everything. So it's actually essentially this the solution we've just written earlier on, but it creates one component for each of the HTML elements, and you can just import those components instead of writing actual elements, and then use Svelte components to switch between different type of elements, right? But there's caveats over here, right? Caveat is that if you want to add event listeners to your components, you kind of actually want to listen to the elements itself, right? So here what it does is that it has no idea what kind of events that can be listened. So at a time we try to forward most of the commonly used events, right? So listen, focus, and dispatch as a focus event, as a component events, try to forward those. And for those that not that commonly used, add subscribe actions to try to listen to it, right? So if you look at the README, it says that for some of the events, it's so only a few event handlers are forwarded. Some of them you would have to pass it this way, right? Instead of writing on mouse enter equals to preload, you would say listen and then object of mouse enter preload. So it's like a in-between kind of solution to work around, but it's genuine. It's interesting enough that it uses a Svelte components. Clever and use that to and wrap all the components, right? Spend one time effort to create components for each of the HTML elements, and then so that you can just switch between dynamic. So you use a dynamic component to actually dynamically switching between elements, right? So so these are two alternatives that I found that is widely commented and useful enough for this moment. But I promise that I want to, try something different so that at least you're not disappointed by this solution. This is actually a solution that I would say that you should go for this before we have a dynamic Svelte elements ready shipped out to you. This is what you should do. But if you come in here and disappointed, I have something for you, because I want to share as well. Let's try to do something difficult and learn something in the process. Although I know that you may have already learned a lot in the first 10 or 20 minutes of this video, right? So what we are going to do here is that we're going to achieve something. We're going to write a dynamic elements component that actually dynamically swaps out elements, right? So what I said earlier on is that I want to see a dynamic elements that actually swap out its children. So every time when you have a div, you wrap things with div, and then later on when you switch to say a span or a button, you create a button element, and then you shove all the existing children for your div to that button element, and then you swap your div out with a button, right? And later on, if you switch it to say span, then you create a span element again and swap it out, move all the children over the new container so that the children elements is not being destroyed. It can still be used, so that you don't have to recreate and reattach event listeners and things like that, right? So let's try that out and see how far we can go. Are you ready? So let's see. Okay, so first thing first, I need to have this solution in a constraint of Svelte, right? Because you can't because that is something that, because we're still writing a Svelte component at the end of the day, right? So here, what that means is that I still need the slots elements, because I still need a way to let Svelte to create all this, to insert all my children to a place that I can collect, right? So here, first thing is I'm gonna create a div and have my slots over here. Okay, so this is the first thing. Secondly, I would need some sort of way to get the children of all my slots, right? So first thing is I need to say bind this with a container. Right, okay, so every time, let's see, this is not easy. Let me think about it. And okay, sorry. Okay, so first is I need a function that will be called every time when the s is changed, right? So what we can do is we can have an onMount method and figure things out over there, right? Okay, so here is my strategy, right? So I use a div to wrap around the slots, but that's temporarily. What I need to do is I want to have a function called swap, and I want to swap out the container, this container, if swap out this container if the s, the props that we pass in is not a div or is something else. Whenever this change, we want to swap it out. We were gonna call swap, right? So here is this this function that I'm gonna write later on. But here to show that how I'm gonna use it is that first is I'm gonna have an onMount, and during onMount, if the s is not a div, then I need to swap it out, right? Because by default I use a div to contain first, right? I have to choose one element because I have to write something to wrap around my slots. I can have my slots dangling just outside, but in that way, I can have it over here at the top level then, but that way it's hard to collect all these slots elements. And because the parent that it has no parents, its parents is outside of these components. It's actually it's the parent will be the parent of will be the wrapper within this app or Svelte, which is have no control at all. And it will make it harder if we want to clean up later on. So the easier way is we just wrap these slots inside a container for now. So to get like all the children, I will say container.childNodes. Then I can easily get all the elements that is rendered into the slot, right? That is easy for me. So here, I have the s. Okay, so if it's not a div, then because initially I created with a div, if it's not a div, then I'm gonna swap it out. I'm gonna say swap s, right? And then the next thing I need to do also is that I need to have a way that every time when something has changed, I need to call swap s as well, right? So here, if it's this way, then probably I let's see, swap s. Right, so every time an s has changed, I need to swap it out, and also on onMount, right? But as you can see, the first time calling swap s, let me see. Okay, so this swap s probably will be called during right before onMount. So the first time the container may not be there, that's why you see the error. Right, but I think we just need to check if container. Oh, okay, I think we just say if no container. If there's a container, then we call this. Then from after we mounted, every time we can just call this swap s and every time when ss changes, right? I think may not be the best suggestion. Maybe I should say is mounted equals to false and then call swap as if it's mounted as true. Then on mount we'll call it once, and here we'll call it again. So let me think. The reason we're not doing on container and check is that container may change a few times, right? Okay, I think I know. I will say let original container. So this is a function that will be okay, so I figured out. So over here is mounted, it should be over here. And on mount, I'm gonna just say is mounted equals to true. So that this way it's simpler, that this will only be called once. I'm not using container to check over here. I could have using container to check over here, but so that it will make sure that container is there. But I'm not doing this is because I would actually change this container variable a few times, right? So it's better to say it's mounted. Actually also over here I would call original container equals to container. Then this is only changed once, and I can also use this instead, so that I just use one variable, right? I could do this instead also. So it is the same idea, is that whoops, I removed the wrong variable. As long as it's mounted, I want to do this, right? So here because I'm not doing the on mount, and this can be called anytime, I have no idea whether the initial s is a div or not. So what I can do over here is that I can say if container.node name equals to s dot to uppercase return, right? So if it's the same node, then I don't need to create anything. I don't need to swap it out. So right. So if you console out container.node name, you realize that this will be div in capitals. That's why I have to do uppercase to compare it. So here what I need to do is I need to swap things out, right? Beyond that, let me see. Yeah, that's all I have. So here, how do I swap it out? So first thing is I am going to get all my child nodes, right? And also I need to actually create a new target, right? New target equals document create element s, and I'm going to write a I'm going to copy all of this over here. So here I'm going to say for each child, and I'm going to move it over to target append child equals child, right? So I shift all the child from the original container to the target, and then I would say container dot parent node equals dot replace child, replace the container with target container. And then I get a parent, and I replace me and target. I just put in place to replace this, and then lastly my container will be the target, right? So the original container will be just discarded away. So here, if I try to run this toggle, realize it works. Except that somehow my link is gone, right? Initially I saw that, right? We have a link over here. It works, and then suddenly it's gone. So something must be wrong over here when we try to do the child nodes and append child, right? So let's console out what are the child nodes dot length. How many children do we have, right? So first is we have okay, the container child nodes. Right, first we have 3. Oh, we have 2. What? 1. that something must be wrong. We are having less and less children. Let's see. So I think I kind of know why. Because child nodes itself is a live array. It means that every time when you try to do this, when you append child, you move it over, the child nodes actually has less children now, right? So which means that as it's updating live, when you try to move it away, then imagine like you have an array like that looks like this, right? Array that looks like 1, 2, 3, and you try to loop where the index is 1, 2, and 3. But then this array is live, meaning when you do an append child, you move children, you actually remove from the original one and add it to a new one. So when you remove it, what you end up having is like this. You shift it, and because you are iterating to the next one, then you are not copy over the second one. That's why the more you copy, then eventually you end up really having like 1 and 3 in a new array, and later on you will realize you only have 1 and all the things are gone. So what I can do here is that while container dot child nodes dot length, so I just need to keep shifting all the children over, and while it still have any children, we'll just keep looping. Now if you take a look, child, okay, I'm gonna say this is the first element, right? Yeah, we now we have all the elements copied over, right? That's great. So let's take a look at the ultimate check that why we spend so much effort to do this is that now if we take a look at this span, I'm gonna assign this to elements. Okay, I'm gonna assign this to a variable. Right, so see the span is pointing this span, and try to toggle, and is it not span equals to okay, span 2 equals to 0, span equals to span 2. It is still true, but I'm not sure why hovering this does not leads me to the same elements, but span is equals to span 2. And if you toggle again, and if you come over here, inspect, and you say span 3 equals to this new span, right? And you say span equals to span 3, it is still the same span elements. It's still the same elements that you're looking at. Because we move the children over and swap the container out, so we didn't really recreate everything, right? So this trick will be useful if you want to do something like a portal, things like that, where you want to move elements around. Then probably this video may be helpful for you, right? You never know, you learn something new today, right? So lastly, and when I do this, I know that something may go wrong, and which is when I try to turn this off, you realize that I can't hide the element anymore, and it says that cannot read property remove child off now. This is a very common problem when you try to move the children around, and now Svelte has no idea what is the final elements that you are showing on the screen. And worse is because we do the replace child, we swap the target and container away, we end up in the case where the original container no longer has a parent because we remove it, right? We take it out, we swap it out, so the original container has no parent. And if you want to remove this elements, it says this container, the original container dot parent node is null, and you try to call remove itself, you end up this error. Right, so this error happens when Svelte try to removes everything, right? It will look at the top level elements like this, and you will see this container dot parent nodes dot remove child itself, right? And because this container is no longer the container that we are looking at, because we really swap it out, so this is actually the original container, and it is already being swapped out. It has no parent, therefore this is null, and this is remove child of null, therefore you have this error. Right, so what should we do about this? So here a few ways we can do to take care of this. Right, first thing is we on destroy, we come over here and do our last swap. We swap back our original container. Right, we say container. Let's just copy things. It's much easier. Container parent node replace target. We replace the original. And this is why I added this reference to the original one so that I can swap it back out. So now if you take a look, I toggle a few times and I hide. It's being hidden nicely, right? So we don't have to take care about so that the original container that Svelte, which is this reference that the Svelte is still pointing to, still referring to, have a parent, because we swap it back in and now you call its parent to remove itself, right? So if you toggle and then you turn on and off, everything still works fine as it is, right? So here we've also solved a problem that some of you may have encountered before, where it says remove. I can't call a remove child of parent of null. This is what you need to do, and this also actually fits into why originally I want to create I want to add this slot element inside the div, inside a container, because how Svelte actually unmounts a component, how does it removes all its elements inside, is actually it will not go all the way to, like for example, if you have a very deep div here, okay, it actually does not go on every level to remove this from its parent, remove this from its parent, and remove this from its parent. It does not really do that way. But what it does is that it will just look at the top level elements and try to remove them. Unless you're telling me that this is a component, then I will have to call the component unmount to do some cleanup, right? But this is all elements, then I will just remove from the top level. So once this is out from the entire tree, then it's gone, right? It's poof, gone. So if I have a container and wrap my slots, then it's easier. If I have a slots on the top level, then to do the cleanup, to swap it things out and things like that will be way harder. I wouldn't want to imagine. Right, so here we explored some interesting alternative that you can use to swap children around, still maintain the original reference of your elements, and swap out the parent container using some HTML DOM API magic. Right, so if you have any questions, comments down below. I'm sure you do have any questions. Comments down, just shoot them in. Right, if you learned something, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, share it to your friends, share it to the world. And as always, remember to subscribe to my channel so you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye.